In its most basic sense, nuclear deterrence is the idea that by making threats of nuclear violence, you can ensure your own security by preventing other countries from invading you or from attacking you with nuclear weapons or with overwhelming conventional military force. But the way that it actually works in practice is far removed from the very kind of simplistic way that we understand that idea. So let me unpack a little bit around ways to think about deterrence and what it is and how it works. So if you think of the most basic sense, far removed from nuclear weapons, think about a child that's misbehaving. If a child's misbehaving and you threaten it with some kind of punishment, like you're going to ground the child or send them to their room, if that child then continues to misbehave and you don't carry out the threat, then what they learn is that your threat is not credible. You're not actually going to do what you say, so there's no consequences for them if they keep misbehaving. And what that means is that the next day, they're quite likely probably to keep doing whatever it was that they're doing. Now, if you bring that across into the nuclear realm, one way to look at that is nuclear threats only work if they're credible. So if you make threats against your adversary and your adversary doesn't believe that you're actually willing to follow through with those threats, it's unlikely that they're going to be deterred from doing whatever it is that you would like to deter them from doing. And so the way that people generally tend to talk about and think about what makes for a credible nuclear threat is that you need to have the capability to attack with nuclear weapons, and you also need to have the willingness. You need to have the willingness to take the moral risk of saying, yep, I will annihilate all human life. If that's what it comes to, I will start a global nuclear war in the interests of my imagined political community. So the trouble is that, so that's the sort of theory of how you make credible nuclear threats in order to deter your adversary from taking whatever action it is that you want to deter. The trouble is that in practice, that's so far removed from the reality of the way the world works. And I'll break it down just a little bit further, which is to say, when we assume that we can make nuclear threats and our adversary will be deterred by those threats, we assume a whole lot of things which I would argue are not really valid assumptions. So the first is that all of these leaders of nuclear armed states, they're rational and they act rationally. The second is that on top of being rational, they share the same rationality as us. So basically, when you make a threat of nuclear annihilation or of indiscriminate nuclear violence, that your adversary is going to A, respond with fear, and B, that fear is going to lead them to caution. So they're not going to escalate or across the nuclear threshold into a nuclear war. And then you also have to assume that in any crisis moment, as you're trying to escalate or de-escalate a crisis, that both you and your adversary have all of the information that they need to make those decisions. You know, Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, should we escalate or should we not? Well, you need information to tell you, well, what are we facing? What capabilities does our adversary have? Are they willing to use them? And what we found in the Cuban Missile Crisis is that none of these things were true. So this idea that all actors are rational, well, maybe they are, but, you know, is Kim Jong-un always rational? Is Donald Trump always rational? Is Vladimir Putin invading a sovereign country and thinking that he can just take it over and then make nuclear threats and there's not going to be consequences? Is that rational? Maybe it is according to his version of rationality, but clearly it's not a rationality that the rest of the world shares. So this idea that all actors are rational, that they share the same rationality, it's just not matched by the historical reality. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a great example of that is that the two actors, arguably, that stood to lose the most, so Castro and then the head of West Germany, and bearing in mind that we'd had two crises in Berlin already over the status of Berlin, both of those leaders who potentially risked all-out nuclear war in which they would be the first victims, constantly pushed, on one hand, pushed the Soviet Union to escalate the crisis in Cuba, and on the other hand, constantly pushed Kennedy to escalate the crisis from the American side. So they clearly weren't acting in a way that, personally, I would consider to be rational. And then if you look at the idea of information, what information do actors have to use in a nuclear crisis? Well, Kennedy was wildly misinformed. So, for one, he didn't know that there were already active nuclear weapons on Cuba. They assumed that those weapons were not active. They were. Two, they vastly underestimated the numbers of Soviet troops that were on Cuba that might cause a problem if they used military action against Cuba. And three, they didn't know that there were Soviet nuclear-armed submarines circling Cuba at the time, and that those submarines had authority to use their nuclear weapons, their nuclear torpedoes, if they came under attack. And so on the basis of all of this misinformation that Kennedy was fed by his giant intelligence machine, the United States did escalate on the basis of that faulty information. And for example, the US Navy started dropping dummy depth charges to try and force the Soviet submarines to surface, which nearly led to a use of one of those nuclear torpedoes that could have triggered a nuclear war. So in all of these ways, basically what we find is that deterrence did not act the way that the theory books, that the academics tell you that it worked. And yet, the lesson that we took away from Cuba was that it did, and that it was this example of Kennedy, playing out the deterrence playbook and winning, the crisis, or coming out of the crisis as a victor. And it's just very removed from the reality of what happened.